3 weeks before, what happened, the Bush administration eliminated the moratoriums on offshore drilling off the Pacific and off the Atlantic. The Obama administration implemented it in the Pacific, and that's the graphic that, I'm sorry, in the Atlantic, and that's the graphic that we saw. Put in place the plan to start the drilling, and that was 3 weeks before the blowout. So that's why immediately after the blowout, Obama took a step back and let BP go forward. Because think if Obama had immediately done what he should have done, which was to nationalize everything, it would have been such an immediate admittance of how wrong he was 3 weeks prior to say, we can trust the oil industry, they're great. Obviously, we couldn't and we shouldn't have. What should have happened and what didn't happen and what needs to happen, and I'm going to transition to the local groups, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about. What needed to happen is that what BP is concerned about, most concerned about, and has been from the beginning, and the one thing they've done really, really well, actually even though all of the devices have failed, is they're really concerned about stopping the spill. Because that's the one place where they are absolutely, completely, totally liable. For every barrel that leaks, they're gonna have to pay $4,300. And they need to stop that leak, because they're gonna have to pay that money. And the 76 million, I wish the left would stop being so obsessed with this cap. It's not gonna hold. All they have to do is found negligent. They've already been found negligent. They're gonna pay more than that, and we have so many other more important things to worry about. They're gonna pay more than that 76 million. We have so many more regulations and problems to be concerned about. They're gonna pay a lot, and they're probably gonna pay a lot more. But they're obsessed with getting the spill stopped. What they don't care about at all is everything that happens after that. They don't care at all about once the oil hits the water. They do care about making it look less bad, which is why they're using the dispersants. It makes it look not as bad, so that there's less public pressure. There's no other reason to use the dispersants. So one of the deep concerns of the local communities, and what I was incredibly impressed with everywhere I went, all along the Gulf, was the incredible resilience of the amazing organizing of local groups. The federal government has failed. The one thing the federal government has done well, because the Coast Guard is in charge of BP at the site of the spill, is monitor that. That's been pretty good. Everything else after that, there's nobody in charge of. It's pure chaos. There's fighting between the states. 5 states are impacted, right? Florida, Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama. Each governor is dealing with it in a different way. Each state agency is dealing with it in a different way. The federal agencies are fighting with the state agencies, are fighting with BP. There's nobody in charge. And what that ultimately creates is deep concern out of the same thing that BP is most concerned about, and that's liability. So you've got state governments that won't spend money on things because they're afraid that BP won't reimburse them. So what I heard time and time again from the local groups was that this spill could have and should have been able to be contained at the source. While BP was obsessed with shutting down the spill, at the source, what should have happened right away was every oil corporation in sight should have sent everything it had there, every state should have sent everything it had, the federal government should have sent everything it had, and we should have been able to hold the oil there. And we could have, but we didn't. So now the question is how to deal with the fact that we have all of this. So the dispersant is a toxin. All it does is make it much, much, much more difficult to clean up the mess. So the one thing that you can do with oil, and just remember after Exxon Valdez, only 11% of the oil has ever been cleaned up, only 11%. What you can do is gather it up like a glop. This is when you can gather it up, right? I've got it in a bag. I've been carrying it in a Ziploc bag. What you can't do is pick it up in a Ziploc bag when it's been dispersed, right? So what you want is to keep it together so that you can at least try and scoop it up. You don't want to burn it. You don't want to spray dispersant on it. And you want to try and collect it. What the local groups have been dealing with, and one of the biggest failures of the state the state government and the federal government, is the health consequences. So what's happening is that we're now experiencing, as opposed to short-term exposure to toxin, and remember, the oil is a toxin and the dispersant is a toxin. And it's not only in the water, it becomes an aerosol. So it's lifting up off the ocean, and it's collecting together, and then it goes everywhere. So the workers are being exposed, but also every single person who lives in a coastal community is exposed. And this is now not short-term exposure, it's long-term exposure. So what they are experiencing is what everyone who lives near an oil refinery experiences. It is long-term respiratory, heart exposure and consequences, cancer. Most at risk are small children, pregnant women, the elderly. But the only people who are doing briefings on this topic are the community groups. So one of the best local community groups, the Louisiana Environmental Action Network, LEAN, an incredible woman named Wilma Subra, who's a toxicologist, has been independently going around to doctors explaining when people show up at your hospital, this is what it means that they're having these problems. Going to communities and saying, when you're having these problems, this is why. She's the person doing it. There's now discussion, among many people with children and pregnant women, that they need to leave the exposure zone. But what Wilma's doing is emblematic of groups like Mobile Bay Keepers, groups all across the coast, all the way to Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, who are doing community organizing. And what's amazing is that networks were born post-Katrina. The first word on everybody's lips is Katrina, still. Networks were born post-Katrina that link community groups all along the coast. And they are doing the organizing, the advocacy, the education, the enforcement, calling on communities and community groups to stand up together to demand of state government and federal government that they create change. And that organizing and that advocacy is powerful and is there. However, they need our support. They need our financial support, our organizing support, our keeping the spotlight on. Because of this cap, and we can talk about the cap in questions, mainstream media is starting to leave. The spotlight's already starting to leave, and they need our help in maintaining the spotlight so that the policies that need to be put in place will be put in place. The money that needs to get to them will get to them. The policy changes that need to happen will happen. That we don't have cosmetic fixes in policy, but we have long-term policy change. The call for a permanent moratorium, which needs to be implemented in the Gulf, in the Pacific, and the Atlantic, isn't going to be able to come from those states. It's too difficult for it to come from those states. It has to come from out here. If it isn't going to come from California, it's not going to come from anywhere. The calls for permanent breaking up of the oil industry, of separation of oil and state, I have to stop, but really quickly, one of the rumors that's now flying is Exxon and Chevron are talking about either purchasing BP outright, which I don't see as incredibly likely, but most certainly purchasing large BP assets, which means that they would become even bigger, even more powerful. BP is the largest oil producer and natural gas producer in the United States. If those assets were purchased by Exxon or Chevron, that would be deeply problematic. And by Chevron, for us, Chevron's the largest oil company in California, the most powerful corporation in California, the second largest oil corporation in the United States, the fifth largest corporation on the planet. If they became bigger, that would be very problematic for us locally and as a state, but also it would obviously be very problematic nationally and internationally. So they need our attention, our organizing, and our support. So fortunately, the Mobilization for Climate Justice is here to help us do that. Global Exchange is here to help us do that. I hope in my continued trips down to the Gulf, I can continue to bring information and linkages and activism. And thank you all for being here. I look forward to your questions.